the Gwinnett County Public Library. I'm Amy Perry, an Adult Services Specialist here at the library. Thank you for joining today's program, Accessible Adventures. Today's presenter is Sylvia Longmire. Sylvia is an award-winning accessible travel writer and photographer, author, entrepreneur, and disability rights advocate. She is also a service-disabled U.S. Air Force veteran, full-time wheelchair user, single mother, and the former Miss Wheelchair USA 2016. Sylvia is the founder of the award-winning Spin the Globe travel blog, on which she shares her adventures traveling around the world in a power wheelchair. She focuses on the wheelchair accessibility of her destinations, encouraging fellow wheelchair users to explore the world. Her accessible travel writing has been featured in the New York Times, New Mobility Magazine, and Lonely Planet, to name a few. She has also published 4 accessible travel-related books. Please welcome Sylvia.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining the webinar today. I'm always excited about the opportunity to talk about accessible travel and my own adventures, for better or for worse. And like Amy said, and thank you for the lovely introduction, just to encourage people with disabilities and especially fellow wheelchair users to travel the world. So I figured I would start by talking a little bit about my history, how I became just kind of a travel writer, but also a wheelchair traveler, and then talk a little bit about how I go about travel and some of the places I've been and how I go about choosing my destinations and making travel happen. And then I'm more than welcome to answer any questions that you might have. So I've been a traveler since I was little. I'm currently 49 years old, and I started travel at the ripe age of 5 with my parents on road trips, going up to Canada and back. My father is terrified of flying, so we did a lot of road trips and a lot of cruises when I was very little. And I was actually telling Amy before the webinar started that Ottawa is one of the places that I used to go to with my parents every few years by road trip from Florida, South Florida, and I'm actually going to Ottawa on Thursday, so I'm very excited to go back. So yeah, I saw 22 states, I think, by the time I was 16 years old, and had already been on maybe 3 or 4 cruises with my parents. So I got bit by the travel bug at a very early age. I was in the Air Force, as Amy said. I'm a service-disabled veteran, and I traveled a lot, again, with my parents and when I was younger. And when I was on active duty, fortunately, the Air Force provides a generous leave for active duty members. So I started traveling by myself for the first time in my 20s. I found that other people weren't that interested in traveling with me, or just didn't have the time or the money. And I'm a pretty independent person. So I said, why am I going to wait around for other people to either want to travel or have the time or the money to do it? I'm just going to go try and do it. So my very first solo trip, I was 26, and I went on a cruise tour, which is like 5 days on a cruise ship, and then 3 days at the front end, and then 4 days at the back end for the departure and arrival. And it was my first time traveling solo, and it was, go big, go home, go to Europe. And it was my first time going to Europe. And I just absolutely fell in love with both. I got to meet some really great people. And one of the best things about solo travel, because solo travel isn't for everybody, one of the best things I find about solo travel is that I get to meet people that I normally wouldn't talk to or get to meet when I'm traveling with somebody else. And once a year, I go on a trip with my best friend. She lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, and she comes down here and we go somewhere together. And she's very outgoing like I am. So we do talk to a lot of people. But generally, when we're doing something, she and I are focused on each other. If you're traveling with a spouse, or like I have 2 teenage boys, if the 3 of us are traveling together, maybe we're more focused on talking to each other than talking to strangers, or maybe a tour guide or something like that. So people come up to me and talk to me because they find it kind of unusual to see a woman in a wheelchair traveling by herself. And in foreign countries, sometimes I get people are more curious about me in the United States than they are abroad, but that's just kind of, I think, a cultural thing. But I meet the most fascinating people when I travel. And I have a travel memoir, a solo wheelchair travel memoir that I published a few years ago, called What Happened to You. And it's all different travel stories. It's 15 chapters, 15 travel stories. but the unifying thread is all the interesting people that I've met along the way, the interactions I've had with them, and the things I've learned from them. And those interactions may not have been possible if I had been traveling with somebody else. So that's kind of one of the things. So that started when I was 26. And then after I got married, I really didn't do much travel. My husband at the time wasn't really interested in doing a lot of travel while we were married. And then we had young children. So it was challenging, and it was more expensive. So my passport collected a little bit of dust. So I got divorced in 2015. And then because my children were now living with their dad, I found myself by myself for the first time in quite some time. And because of the trauma of divorce and everything that goes along with that, I was looking for something to help me heal and kind of start my life over again by myself. And travel has always served that purpose for me as something very healing, something very educational, and just it helps me find a lot of peace and perspective. But now I'm a wheelchair user. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2005 while I was on active duty, but I didn't start using a wheelchair until roughly 2014. I had MS progresses slowly for some people, more rapidly for other people. So I started using a cane in, I'm going to say 2009, 2010. Then I progressed to a walker in 2011. And then I slowly started using a scooter kind of part-time for longer distances. And I was still able to walk a little bit, get the scooter in and out of my car. So that was helpful. But even traveling with a scooter domestically, even though I was still able to walk a little bit, posed a bit of a challenge. Like, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how the airlines would transport it, how to prevent any damage. I traveled with my walker as well. So that's kind of started, I guess you could say, my educational journey to figure out how to do those things. But at the time, it was only a matter of looking up the airline policy for how to do those things. I was able to still walk on and off the plane by myself, so it wasn't as big of an issue. So now I'm divorced. It's 2015, and I say, okay, I want to start traveling again, but now I'm having these difficulties or these challenges walking. And at the time, there were very few outlets online, very few travel blogs, if any, about accessible travel. And accessibility, I mean, we've had the Americans with Disabilities Act since 1990, but the travel sector still hadn't really caught on to the benefit of improving accessibility of destinations, of cruise ships and things like that, because they didn't realize the value that we really provided as a market segment. So it was challenging to come across that kind of information. Now, for context, I've been a professional writer for quite some time. At the time was kind of the height of a lot of activity with Mexico's drug war and border security. And I started working as an expert in that field in 2009. And I was one of the top experts on Mexico's drug war, writing about El Chapo. Anytime El Chapo escaped from prison or got recaptured or anything, I was kind of splashed across the news. I've been on every major cable news channel, some international news channels. I've been in 2 documentaries on the History Channel, consulted with a couple of shows on National Geographic Channel. So yeah, I was doing a lot of that. So I had been writing professionally already for quite some time. So I was working on that in 2015, when I moved here to Central Florida and started doing all this travel. So my first trip post divorce was a road trip. I love road trips. I go on them with my sons every summer. We have one coming up in a couple weeks. So I was I had been living in Arizona for a while, had been to Arizona before, but it always seemed to be such a healing place. And I wanted to go back to Arizona and to Utah. So I flew out to Phoenix. I rented a car with hand controls, and I decided to go up to Sedona, over to Four Corners. Monument Valley had been on my bucket list for a really long time. And then up to Salt Lake City and kind of do that. And it was an incredibly healing and emotional journey. That part of the country is a very spiritual place. It has a lot of Native American presence there. Particularly, I find some sort of affinity with a Navajo for whatever reason. I don't really know. So just being out there in that part of the country and being surrounded by so much beauty and so much nothingness was really, really healing for me. Then I in December, I have two friends that were they're professor. One is a professor, the other's a teacher. And they were living in Dubai for a couple of years on contract, one at a high school and one at a college. And they kept saying and telling people over and over again, hey, you have a free place to stay. Come on out and visit us. I'm like, oh, Dubai, my goodness. Well, that's really far, and I had never really considered it. Well, coincidentally, in December, this was 2015. In December of 2015, I live in Orlando, and Emirates Airlines had just started a direct flight from Orlando to Dubai. I was like, oh, I took that as a sign. I really took that as a sign. It's 16 hours. And I was, again, thank God I was still able to walk a little bit. And I said, well, go big or go home. So that was my first international trip as a scooter user. And that flight was brutal. I'm not going to lie. But once I got there, and I did have friends that I could stay with, and it was incredible. And I said, well, you know what? If I can fly 16 hours to Dubai and manage that portion by myself, and manage everything in a foreign country, then I can pretty much go anywhere after that experience. So that was in February of 2016. A few months later, I booked a cruise with my best friend, an Alaska cruise. And that was my first time cruising with a scooter. We managed to make that happen. Later that year, let's see, that summer, was it? No, I can't remember if that was the summer I went on a cruise, but later that fall, I decided to go to Iceland again by myself. And there was an accessible tour company there that went well. And in November, I fulfilled the bucket list item I had had for 25 years and went to Sydney, Australia. And again, that was a long trip. I had to go from Orlando to LA, spent the night there because there was no way I was going to make that entire trip in a day. And then went direct from Los Angeles to Sydney. And when I got in my hotel room, I remember I was staying at the Intercontinental in downtown Sydney, and my window had a view of the Sydney Harbor Bridge. And I remember I got in that room and I looked out the window and I just burst into tears. It was just, I get emotional now just thinking about it. I'm like, my God, after 25 years of wanting to come to Australia, here I am. And not only am I here, but I'm here by myself as a scooter user. And just the fact that I had accomplished that just kind of blew my mind. And it was really such an incredible trip. So after I got back from Sydney, I said, you know what? I'm a professional writer. There aren't that many outlets out there about accessible travel. The ones that are out there are, they're pretty good, but as far as the writing goes, I really felt like I could make a big contribution in that field. So I said, you know what? I'm going to start my own blog and start writing about my experiences, because surely other people can learn from my successes and also kind of learn from my mistakes and not do this again. So my Spin the Globe travel blog was formed. Now, at the time, for me anyway, there was absolutely no money in it, nothing whatsoever. It was almost like a journal. I was experienced in writing, but I wasn't experienced in blogging. So it was really just looking like journal entries. I didn't know anything about SEO. I was taking photos with my phone, but I wasn't really schooled in the finer points of composition or editing or anything like that. So really, it was a very novice thing to do. But as time went on and I started going on more trips, I started doing more writing, and I started taking the blogging more seriously. I started going to travel blog conferences, learning about SEO, learning about how to take better photos, learning about videos for YouTube. Instagram Reels weren't so much a thing at the time, and I wasn't really using Instagram very much. This was all very new, and travel blogging wasn't anywhere near as big as it is now. But I just, again, slowly started learning, and just kept writing and writing. And then after a few years, I started learning through these travel blogging conference how to start pitching destinations. And at first, my press trips were just travel was paid for and that was it. But as I started to gain more followers on social media, started getting more readers on my blog site, then destinations started looking for me. And then after a bit more time, I started getting more information out there, doing more media interviews for big name publications. I started pitching op-ed pieces, which is how I got published in the New York Times and in Lonely Planet. The Washington Post did a story on me for a competition that I won for Amtrak and a trip that I did with them on the auto train from here, my hometown in Sanford, Florida, up to DC. And just more and more opportunities started coming my way. So now I get paid. Now I get paid to go on press trips on top of my travel. I still do a lot of media. I get to do really cool things like I'm doing right now and talking to people, educating them about accessible travel from high schools to Fortune 500 companies. And really, it's the best job in the entire world. I'm not going to lie, it really is. And yeah, getting to travel with my children every summer is pretty amazing. So yeah, I've been lucky to go to, let's see, where am I at count wise? I've been to 57 countries total, 48 of those as a wheelchair user, 35 of those as a solo wheelchair user. I lost count. I think I'm at 36 cruises. 30 of those, 30 or 31 of those as a wheelchair user, most of them solo. Um, I've been, I think, to almost every port of call in the Caribbean. I've done a cruise in the Baltic and I've done several cruises in the Mediterranean. And that's still my favorite way to travel and the number one way that I encourage wheelchair users to travel for the accessibility. Um, as far as how I choose my destinations, it's one of two ways. One way is saying, well, I really want to go here. For whatever reason, I really want to go here. Let me take a look at the accessibility and see if it's doable. If there's either an accessible tour company, if there's accessible public transportation or accessible taxis, and kind of go that way and see if I can make it happen. The other way I do it is to discover, sometimes just by accident, I'll come across, like I'm in two different Facebook groups actually I'm in several for accessible travel. One of them is Accessible Travel Club, about 50% Europeans, 50% Americans, and people post in there asking questions or sharing experiences. So every now and then I'll be just kind of, that'll pop up in my feed and I'll see a post from somebody in a wheelchair who went to XYZ destination and they used a travel company or they had a really good experience and were able to get around. And it's a destination I never would have thought of. Or just in my professional circles, I'll come across a new accessible tour company in a certain country, a certain city. And I'll say, you know what? I never had any interest in going there, but if they're going to make it accessible, or if I have a tour company, I'll go check it out. And I remember that's what happened with Poland. There's an accessible tour company out there. For whatever reason, and I had already been to Europe several times, but for whatever reason, I just never had an interest in Poland. And I said, well, I can go there. I'm going to go there. And it turned out to be absolutely amazing. I spent several days in Warsaw. I spent several days in Krakow, and Krakow is just, oh, it's so beautiful. And I said, all right, well, let me keep doing this. So the same thing happened with the Czech Republic, with Prague. Oh, I want to go back to Prague so badly. It's amazing. And Romania. I don't have to go back to Romania. I'm glad I went. Everybody asked me, it's like, oh, what's the worst place you've been to for accessibility? I'm like, yeah, that's about it. But I had a tour company and a great tour guide. So again, it was an experience. I saw things that I had never seen before, learned a lot about the people and the history. So yes, I'm still glad I went, but I really don't need to go back. And Seoul, South Korea. I was in the Air Force for several years. And usually when people hear the word Korea and you're in the military, you think, oh, remote assignment, got to go back to Korea. It just never seemed like anything I was excited about. But again, found a tour company out there, and Seoul is really one of the more accessible places in all of Asia. And it turned out to be an amazing experience. So that's kind of how I pick and choose where I go. So sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's accidental, and it's all absolutely an amazing experience, especially if I'm able to do it by myself and have those discoveries. As far as travel planning goes, travel planning is a challenge for anybody, but for wheelchair users or people with other disabilities, it's an entire monster. It really is. And it usually takes people with disabilities around 3 or 4 times as long to plan a trip sometimes as it does for somebody who is able-bodied, because the information that we need is not consolidated. Um, Also, for things like booking accessible hotel rooms, a lot of people can book flights or hotel rooms or cruises using third-party outlets like Expedia or Kayak or things like that. We can't really do that because the ADA has a lot of recourse if we book accessible hotel rooms and something goes wrong. There is a lack of accessibility. If there are violations of the ADA, we can file civil suit. We can file suit against those hotel rooms for recourse, and we can't do that if they are booked through a third party. So sometimes we can't get those discounts or those guarantees. So when it comes to how we book travel, it's kind of the reverse from how non-disabled people do it. A lot of times you say, well, let's use Paris as an option. I'll be going to Paris in September for my 50th birthday. So it's just, so let's say, okay, I want to go to Paris. If I'm non-disabled, I can walk, I can stay anywhere I want. Then the first thing I'll do is I'll look at flights. And I say, okay, I can get a round trip to Paris for, I don't know, 800 bucks. All right, that's cool. Where do I want to stay? I want to stay close to the Eiffel Tower. All right, let me take a look at what hotels are available right next to the Eiffel Tower. I found one that meets my budget. I'll book that hotel. When I get there, like nobody, you don't really want to rent a car in Paris. So I get there, I'm like, okay, cool. I can either walk or I can take a cab or I can take the metro or I can take a bus. I'm good to go. And I can eat anywhere I want. I can go to any of the museums. I can go into any of the attractions. Cool. That's not the case when you're a wheelchair user. I have to do it in reverse. Okay. So when I started planning this trip to Paris, the first thing I had to take a look at, the very first thing was accessible transportation, which sounds kind of weird if you're walking. But if I can't get from the hotel, or if I can't get from the airport to my hotel, and if I can't get from my hotel to all the different attractions that I want to get to, that trip has ended before it's even begun. So I take a look, and there's an accessible transport company called G7 Accessible Taxis. All right, cool. Can I book that in advance to get from the from the airport to the hotel? Yes. Once I get to the hotel, I got to pick a hotel near a bus station or a bus stop. I can't use the metro in Paris. There's only one line that is accessible, and it doesn't really go to the places that you would need to go to for the different sites. So, all right, but I'm close to a bus line. Then, of course, I have to figure in the budget. Am I exactly right next to where I want to be? No, but balancing all those things and whether I'm able to take the bus to get to where I want to go, that's much more important than anything else. So, all right, I can do that. Okay, once the accessible transportation is checked off, are there things to do? Yes. Fortunately, Paris for accessibility as far as like the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, the different museums. Obviously, Notre Dame is not an option right now, but Sacre-Cœur and and Montmartre, I can get there. The cafes are tough, but fortunately, in Paris, a lot of the eateries have outdoor seating. So I don't have to go inside. I can sit outside to eat. Plenty of accessible hotels with air conditioning. That's another thing you have to think about. I have multiple sclerosis, so I'm very sensitive to the heat. And in Europe, a lot of places don't have air conditioning, so I have to make sure that the hotel has air con. So all right, once I've got the things to do, then I take a look at the hotels. That's tough overseas. Here, by law, the hotels have to allow you to book an accessible room in the same way that you would book a non-accessible room. In Europe, there is no ADA. In Asia, there is no ADA. So a lot of times you have to email the property or call them. And accessibility in Paris isn't the same definition necessarily as it is here. So many times I have to ask them to send a photo if they can, or send measurements. What I do, I go into that accessible travel club group on Facebook, and I do a search for Paris and take a look at other people's experiences. And oftentimes they will have photos of their room. So they'll tell me if the accessibility was good or not good. So again, all of this takes a lot of time. And only at that point can I start looking for flights. And yeah, accessible flying is a whole different beast. And I don't have time to go into that. But let's just say that flying as a wheelchair user, on average, 29 wheelchairs get damaged or lost by US Airlines every single day. That's the equivalent of somebody, if you're walking off the airplane and having member of the ramp crew just take a 2x4 and break your kneecaps as soon as you're walking off the plane. Many wheelchairs, I use a travel chair that costs $5,000 when I travel. The chair that I'm in right now is a bigger rehab chair. This one costs $35,000 and it's custom designed for me. So if that gets damaged, I can't just use a manual chair that the airport provides. I can't do that. So we're fighting to try to improve that situation. And then finally, cruises. God, I love cruises. And the newer the ship, the better the accessibility. And cruise lines heavily court people who are older, who have mobility challenges, wheelchair users, because now they're starting to realize how big of a market we are. At the latest count, I believe we're at $83 billion every year that people with disabilities spend on travel alone in the United States. So destinations, cruise lines, hotels, Disney, Universal, theme parks, and things like that are starting to realize how much money we provide as a market. So we're slowly starting to see some improvements in the sector, in the travel sector, when it comes to courting people with disabilities. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from in my experience. And if you have any questions at all, either about accessible travel, about my life as a wheelchair user with my disability, or anything at all, I am more than happy to answer what I can.
Thank you, Sylvia. I know you, excuse me, you gave a lot of good advice and information. While we're waiting for people to put questions in to the chat or the Q&A, I have a question. What is something that you wish hotels, we'll just say here in the US, since we know it has a little bit more control, what is something that you wish hotels or other tourist destinations, what is it that they need to do to get it right for things to be
Sure.
accessible?
That's a wonderful question, and I'm glad you asked it. And starting with the hotels, um, what I tend to find in the travel sector is that sometimes the profit margin is very slim. So it's not required by law for hotels or destinations or theme parks or whatever. It's not required to hire an accessibility consultant. And I would, I think most wheelchair users would love it if hotels would hire somebody to go through their hotels or their properties to, as a wheelchair user, to just tell you this is not okay. The biggest thing with ADA violations in hotel rooms is bathrooms. For example, we have for those of us who need roll-in showers, the most fundamental thing with the roll-in shower, you have a fold-down bench that has to attach to one wall, and then assuming that you're sitting down on that bench, you can't get up from that bench once you transfer to it. And I would say 50% of the hotel rooms that I book, I can't take a shower because in that room, the shower controls will be completely opposite on the opposite wall from where the bench is, so I can't reach the controls, and that's fundamental. There's no question about that. It's very clearly laid out in the ADA guidelines where the grab bars have to be, where the shower head has to be, where the fold down bench has to be. So there's really no excuse. But even if I complain, it's not like they can move around all the plumbing. Sometimes it's things that have nothing to do with the ADA or not controlled by the ADA. One of the biggest controversies in accessible hotel rooms is the height of the bed. If the bed is too high, I can't transfer into it and I can't stay there. But for other people who have, say, a companion who needs to transfer them to the bed to change them or roll them over in the bed, a higher bed is easier. And the trend now is to send these beds sky high. So it can be a real challenge for us to find a bed that suits us. And I tend to find, and I found out recently, the reason that the beds are getting higher and higher in hotel rooms is because it's starting to cause some injuries or back pain for the housekeeping staff that has to bend over and change the linens on the beds. I'm like, well, Okay. So that's, that's one of the things. So, and things like furniture, that's not covered under the ADA. So many times in a hotel room, I can't close the blinds because there's a couch in the way or a table in the way. But the thing is, hotels make the assumption that wheelchair users will always have a companion with them to do those things for them. Fair enough. Solo wheelchair travelers, not as nearly as common. But the thing is, the mentality is that even if I had somebody traveling with me, whether it's my boys, one of my friends to help me, I don't want them to help me. I want to be able to do it myself. I have two sons. If I'm in a shower, I can't have my sons grab the shower head and shower me. It's not appropriate. And even if it's my best friend, yeah, there's times that she's had to do that for me, but I don't like it. I'm independent, and we all want to be able to do those things for ourselves. So if hotels would just hire somebody, I mean, I would do it for free if they would ask me. Bring me into your property. If it's a new property or if you're looking to update it, just have somebody go and roll around the property and tell you, this is, we need help with this at the buffet. Don't keep the stuff, whether it's the salt shakers or the food, back against the back of the counter. Bring it toward the front so I can get my own food. People are always willing to help me in the hotel. That's what they get paid to do. But I want to be able to do those things for myself. So to ask somebody in the know for a consult on how to improve accessibility, we would really love that.
Thank you for pointing those out. I'm a mother of a college-age son who has cerebral palsy and has mobility impairments and uses a walker. So I've always had my eyes on things that are accessible or not
Yeah.
accessible. And so constantly throughout the day, wherever I am, because I'm always looking for ways that he can be independent as a young man and traveling or in his daily life. And there's so many things that just boggle my mind of, it's a simple thing. If you made it accessible
Yes.
for everyone, you wouldn't need the steps or you wouldn't
Yeah.
need this. So we have to really change our mindset, whether we ourselves have any impairments, or if we have a loved one or a friend, or just in general, if we have public and
Yeah.
spaces of if you're inviting people into your business or service or whatever it might be, we have to change that mindset. So I'm so glad you're doing that. And I'm hoping we can encourage others to push forward on those as well.
Of course.
We have a few questions from our guest. One is, how do I find more about your blog?
Oh, that's very easy. My blog is spin, like spinning around, spintheglobe.net, not .com, .net. And yeah, it's got articles spanning years on different destinations, not only destinations, but also things about hotel rooms, about flying, about trains, about cruises, about anything. So you can just type in the search bar if there's something specific that you're looking for as far as a destination or a manner of travel, or just want to kind of scroll through and get some inspiration or some ideas for different places I've been, and learn about the different accessible things to do and places to stay.
We also have a guest that's from the UK, and they are not familiar with the ADA. Can you give a brief overview of that, please?
Oh, sure. So the ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was signed in 1990, and it's both a civil rights law that outlines what rights we have as wheelchair users of people with disabilities, and also outlines all the different requirements as far as the building codes, construction, not only where ramps need to be placed, but the angle that ramps need to be at, where grab bars in bathrooms, the height and the location of where they need to be placed. And so, yeah, it's a combination of those things. And as somebody who's a disability rights advocate, here in the United States, we have a lot of civil rights legislation, and it's very frustrating for us as people with disabilities that we kind of have to rely on legislation and not just our Constitution and Bill of Rights and stuff to tell us what we can and can't do or what we're allowed to do. It's very frustrating. So even though the Americans with Disabilities Act has been around for quite some time, it's still a long way to go. Another thing about the ADA is that the enforcement of it is up to the wheelchair users. So there is no inspection arm, there's no audit arm, nothing like that. No government agency in the United States that enforces it. For instance, let's say that there's a business that I try to frequent regularly, and they don't have a ramp to get in. Some people are under the impression that there's something called, like, it's grandfathered in. So if that building, if that restaurant, let's say, was built in 1980, that somehow, because they were built before the Americans with Disabilities Act, that they don't have to comply. That's a total myth. So let's say that that restaurant, um, doesn't have a ramp to get in. I want to get in. I can, and they refuse to do it for whatever reason. I can file a suit under the ADA in the United States to make that happen. What's different about an ADA lawsuit is that there's no financial compensation. I think there's 2 states where there might be, but in the majority of cases, we don't get money for that. Um, if I want to file that lawsuit, my remedy is for them to install the ramp. The tricky thing is that if that business can prove that the money that they would have to spend in order to install that ramp would put them out of business, then they kind of get a waiver. So you have a lot of small businesses that are on a very slim profit margin, or they're losing money for whatever reason. So if they can show that, hey, this is too much of a financial hardship for us, then they don't have to comply with the ADA. But yeah, if they have, if their parking lot, if a parking lot is bad, if an entrance is bad, if a bathroom is bad, it's up to me to complain about it. Find an ADA attorney and go through the trouble of filing a lawsuit, just so I'm the one who has to enforce that law. So from our perspective, yes, it's great that we're one of the few countries that has that kind of federal law. Even Canada, I'm going to Canada, and their accessibility laws vary by province. It's not national, and it's disappointing because Canada is obviously a very, very modern country. It's our neighbor, but they don't have a federal law or a national law when it comes to accessibility. And I promise you, that's very frustrating for Canadians as well. So that's what the ADA is. That's what it does. That's how it's enforced. But it still has just like a lot of civil rights legislation, it still has a long way to go.
Thank you. What do you think are some ways people can advocate for more accessibility, either in their own town or as they're traveling?
Sure. Being vocal about it. One thing that I've noticed personally, um, people with disabilities are the largest minority or marginalized group in the world, certainly here in the United States. But we are the least vocal, which means that we get the least amount of visibility, the least amount of attention. I believe, this is just personally, I don't know this for a fact. I believe that it's because, as people with disabilities, we already the attention that we attract just by existing tends to be negative. People look at us, feel sorry for us, feel repulsed by us, just kind of look at anybody and just go, oh, glad that's not me, or I feel so sorry for them. They must be miserable. So we don't, we try to prevent people from giving us that attention, because we don't want people looking at us that way. So we try to stay quiet. Sometimes we can't leave the house. So we are disproportionately represented in the public because so many people with disabilities can't be out in public for logistical reasons. They don't have a car. They just can't go out and do things. Like, I'm out and about all the time. So sometimes disability advocacy, at least for me, is just existing in public, because I go to places that maybe you'll never see a wheelchair user. So I try to help normalize, being in the social space as just any member of the public, and seeing that I'm out and about. And then you get people who just look at you and go, "Oh, good for you. Good for you for being in public." People congratulate me and say they're inspired by me just because I go to a restaurant or I go to a bar. It's one of those things. So a lot of people go in hotel rooms or go out and they don't complain, because they're kind of culturally trained, or socially trained to not make a fuss, not call attention to themselves, or many times they don't know what their rights are. They don't know what they are legally entitled to, so they can't advocate for themselves because they don't know that they're entitled to these, to accessibility, to have this provided for them, especially in the travel sector, when it comes to flying and things like that. So um, I would say, first of all, find out what your rights are. Take a look at the ADA, take a look at the Air Carrier Access Act if you're traveling, if you're flying, find out what your rights are. And if you don't speak up, then the restaurant or the hotel or whatever the store um, will, they don't know. 9 times out of 10, they want to help, and it's just because they're ignorant of the law and they don't know and they want to be better. So by you speaking up and saying, can you please move this clothing rack out of the way? Can you please bring the straws closer to the front of the counter? Then that manager goes, oh, thank you so much for pointing that out. I didn't know. And that makes things better for the next person. So many times I go to hotels and I tell a manager that this is a problem. Oh, I didn't know. Or nobody's ever complained about that before. I hate that. That's like the most condescending thing you can say, because, well, nobody's complained about it, so you're the problem. Or why do you have a problem with it when nobody else has had a problem with it? I'm like, well, I'm willing to bet other people have had problems with it, but they just didn't. They just said, well, I'm leaving tomorrow. I don't want to make a fuss. I just want to go home, and don't say anything. So really speaking up, being aware of your rights and speaking up is not only helpful to your own situation, but really could potentially help a lot of people down the road. And in my opinion, that's what advocacy is really about.
Thank you so much. I think you touched on so many things that I try to encourage for my son. And, he puts himself in different locations, and just because that's what he wants to do. He's not going to have his impairment to stop him, right? And so
Yeah.
he does his
Good.
own advocating just by being who he is and just
Yeah,
educating others. And I think it's so important to start young like that, but also just like never stop learning, just educate ourselves and think of how would that work or not work in different situations.
absolutely.
So you did talk about some of your tips for traveling, but if I were a solo trying something new, where do you think, what would be the ideal destination to try as a new solo wheelchair traveler?
Sure. I always tell people to take baby steps. Take baby steps, start locally. You guys are lucky in the sense that you're close to Atlanta, or that Atlanta is actually pretty good for accessibility as far as transportation. I believe you guys have the MARTA. That's your rail system. So that's accessible. You have accessible buses. You have a very, very big airport. So I tell people, if they've never traveled before as a wheelchair user, start with your local transportation. If I remember the first time I went on a bus, and it wasn't even here, it wasn't even the United States. I think it was in Dublin, or in Belfast. I think it was in Dublin, and I was terrified. Unfortunately, I was in a country that spoke English, so there wasn't a language barrier. But my biggest fear was getting left on the bus. Or not knowing how to push the button, not being able to communicate with the bus driver that this is where I want to go, learning how to use the Google app, that I could track where I had to get off, and also if the bus stop that I wanted to go to was accessible. So starting out small in a place where you can get home easily is good. If you have a metro system or a subway system, try using that for the first time, seeing how the stations work, knowing who you have to talk to if you need help, things like that. Then you can graduate to flying. Yeah, I use Atlanta actually as an example. I live in Florida, so it's like a 45-minute flight. Say if you want to experiment, you can find cheap round trip flights between, a lot of cities that are close to Atlanta. Take a short flight there, hang out in the airport for a little bit and take the flight back, just so you can see, what that's like. Stay in a hotel room in your town. Just for one night, find an inexpensive hotel room that's obviously clean and safe, and go through that experience and just stay there for one night. And if it's absolutely horrible, then either get your money refunded or canceled, and then you can just drive 10 minutes home. So I say start out that way, and take a look. And that way, and that's kind of how I did it. Well, that's a lie. I mean, I started out with Dubai. That was kind of crazy, but no. But before that, though, domestically for work, that I had to travel, and I started taking a look at things. And because my disability progression has been slow, I've been able to kind of start incrementally looking at additional measures. And the last tip I will say, and which has been mentally the most challenging for somebody like me, is to ask for help. That is very difficult for, even if you're not disabled, that's difficult for a lot of people. And the reality is that as people with disabilities, we are completely reliant on other people to provide accessibility for us. I despise that as just the person that I am. I really hate that, but that's the reality. And fortunately, at least here in the United States, and certainly in so many countries that I've been to, almost every country that I've been to around the world, people want to help. They want to make life easier for you. They want you to enjoy their country. They want you to enjoy their cities, and experience their culture, and do things that they can do. They really want to make that happen for you. So over the years, I've gotten a lot better at asking people to help. And sometimes people will volunteer. Sometimes people will help without asking, which is its own adventure. But yeah, just asking for help and being very specific with people about what help that you need, it makes them feel good to help you. And that's one of my bigger tips is learn how to do that.
Right. So another question that came in is, what advice do you have for when you're using your wheel handling the wheelchair on a flight?
Haha,
You
I get that
travel a
question a
lot. You
lot.
told us this the
Yeah.
statistics. So what have you learned to protect your wheelchair while flying?
So, one of the biggest challenges with handling the wheelchairs on planes is that a lot of wheelchairs like this one, right? This one's pretty tall, it's pretty big. This chair weighs 413 pounds. And there are a lot of people out there that this is their only option for traveling is using a big chair like this. I have the flexibility of using a much smaller power chair. So, for the cargo hold doors for planes vary. Some of them are quite small. So the only way to transport this chair would be to put it on its side. This chair is not designed to go on its side. It also requires at least 4 people to try to pick it up and maneuver it. And that's just begging for damage. For a big chair like this, take off anything and everything that is removable and put it in a small bag. And that bag, by law, is allowed to fly for free in the cabin with you. So headrests, armrest, joystick, definitely the joystick, sometimes leg rests. I mean, it can take a long time, but it doesn't matter. By law, they have to allow you to do that. So take off anything that protrudes because those are fewer things that can snap off, and put them in a duffel bag. And if it's something that can't be removed, sometimes wrapping it up in bubble wrap and taping it will help. If your chair requires instructions for moving it, for putting it into neutral so it can be rolled, sometimes putting those instructions with photos or with pictures and arrows and taping it to your chair, that can be very helpful for the ramp crew. I love flying Delta. Delta now has like a little Ziploc bag with a standardized sheet that you fill out when you check in that shows, where your chair needs to be picked up, how much it weighs, all the dimensions. That gets attached to your chair, and you just switch it out. I mean, I keep mine, so you just switch it out whenever you fly. Delta also has little pink tags with a scanner, so it gets scanned at every point, so you can track where your chair is, so it doesn't get lost. So yeah, bubble wrap, removing anything that's extra. For my chair, I have a custom joystick cover that I can attach because the joystick, and it's been snapped off before, but unfortunately not, it's just the little cover. But being able to cover the joystick with that plastic cover has been amazing for preventing damage. So if anything, reach out to the company that manufactures your wheelchair and ask them if there's specific measures. If you use a manual wheelchair, if your manual wheelchair folds and it's small enough, by law, you can put it in the cabin of the plane under certain circumstances. For some people, it'll fit in the overhead bin. For some airlines, as it can sometimes it can fit in the closet. Again, depending if there's not something in there. If there's available seating, they can also allow you to strap your wheelchair in to the seat next to you if it's not a full flight. So again, taking a look at what the rules are, what your rights are, and for that, and reach out to that airline. Many airlines have a special assistance line just for people traveling with mobility aids, and they can tell you what rights you have and what you're able to do as far as protecting your gear.
Great, thank you. You've talked a lot of your tips and your travels, but what happens when something doesn't go as planned? How do you keep calm, or how do you still enjoy your trip?
Uh, First, you cry for a little bit, and then you calm down and you say, "All right, let's get this done." At least that's how I do it. No. having a good sense of humor is very, very important, and having mental flexibility, because something will always not go as planned. Some things will go very wrong. And I'll tell you a travel story. And this is one of the chapters in my memoir. Berlin. Berlin has amazing accessibility for wheelchair users. It's actually won awards for that. It was such a great trip. It was really amazing. So the last day of the trip, I had actually accomplished everything and gone everywhere that I wanted to go. So I had a full day with nothing planned. It's very, very rare that I can schedule anything spontaneously. It just doesn't really happen. So sometimes if I'm in a place with really good accessibility, I can go, hey, let's go do this. So the night before, I said, all right, the rail system in the Autobahn, the S-Bahn, not the Autobahn, the S-Bahn and the U-Bahn are, you have like the internal cities metro, and then you have metros that go like out to the some of the suburbs, and accessibility is great. So I said, okay, where can I go on a day trip? And doing the research, and I saw that I could go to Potsdam. So Potsdam has, the Potsdam Accords has a lot of history. It's very beautiful. And I said, again, like, you look at transportation. All right, I can get there on the S-Bahn. It's at the very end of this line. Once I get there, they have a hop on, hop off bus. They also have local buses that I can go to all the different places that I want to go to. This castle is accessible, this store, this restaurant, or whatever. It's going to be a great day trip. The weather's going to be awesome. Perfect. Get up early, go to now. I get up early. I get on the S-Bahn on the 8 o'clock train. It's a 45-minute ride out there. Absolutely beautiful. I get out there. Awesome. I'm here. I'm excited. I'm stoked. It's going to be beautiful. Get off of the S-Bahn onto the platform, and the elevator that goes from the platform down to the street level is broken. That was my fault. Not the fault. It wasn't my fault. The elevator was broken. It was my fault for not looking at the website for the S-Bahn to see that the elevator was broken, because it does have that update on there. So that was on me. But either way, the elevator was broken. I'm like, I said, okay, let me take a look at what my options are. I could go, that this was the very end of the line. The one station up one station up also had a bus. It was a public bus, but I could go to that station, take the bus over to Potsdam, and then from there hop on the hop off bus. I could still kind of do the same thing in reverse. I'm like, okay, awesome. I waited about 15 or 20 minutes, because the S-Bahn doesn't go as regularly as the U-Bahn does. Waited for the one, went one station over, got off at the station. I'm like, all right, we're gonna make this happen. Elevator's broken. I'm like, the universe is just like, no, no. I take a look again. One more station up, I could do the same thing. Okay. Now I'm burning daylight, right? But again, I'm trying to make this happen. I do the same thing, go to the next station. Nothing wrong with the elevator, but I don't even get off the train, because I'm looking around through the windows, and the neighborhood was kind of run down, some graffiti, and I just did not feel safe getting off of there. And at that point, I had to come to the conclusion that it's just not going to happen. It is what it is. So I got on the train and I cried. And it's a 45-minute ride back. So I said, well, what am I going to do? So I said, all right, let me focus on what I can do instead of what I can't do. So I had a ticket for the Reichstag is the German version, I guess, of Parliament or Congress. And the Reichstag itself was closed that day, but they have a dome, a big glass dome at the very top of the Reichstag that has like a spiral ramp, and you can look down actually into the chamber. It's really, really cool, but you have to book it ahead of time because there are a lot of security measures. Now, I had that booked for, I think, 9 o'clock that morning, and I decided to just skip it because I'd rather spend the whole day at Potsdam. But I still had the paper with my permission, because you have to kind of not necessarily apply, but you got to have a permit to go. And I said, well, the timing was for like 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm not going to get there until later, till 11 at least. I don't know if they're going to let me in, but you don't know unless you try. I said, well, let me see if I can somehow salvage this day. I got to the Reichstag, got into the security line, and I asked the guy, listen, I am so incredibly sorry. Something came up. I wasn't able to get here in time. Is there any possible way that I can still get in? He's like, oh, yeah, sure. I'm like, oh, okay, great. So I got in the line, I got to go in the Reichstag. It was absolutely, beautiful. So I said, all right, what am I going to do? What am I going to do after this? Well, I love museums, and there was like a city museum that I thought would be boring. And but I said, well, I got nothing to do. And I went, and it was really one of the coolest museums I had ever been to. It was really amazing. And then right around the corner from that museum, there was like a farmer's market and arts and crafts festival going on. Again, no plans to go there. I love that sort of thing. And I went, and it was wonderful. And I was at one of the vendors, and I heard English. Not only did I hear English, but I heard him talking about Fort Lauderdale in South Florida. I'm like, hey, that's where I grew up. So I started talking to the guy. We went to the same high school. I'm like, and down in South Florida, I'm like, I'm in Berlin. We weren't in the same year. He was 2 years ahead of me, but I'm talking to this guy. I'm like, oh my God, like what a small world. And then, yeah, I had ended up having an amazing sunset dinner right on the river there. And I mean, it turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful day in Berlin, doing things that I hadn't expected to do. Lots of nice surprises. Yeah, did I miss out on Potsdam? Yeah, I did. But I was able to kind of make, lemonade from lemons just by being not only physically flexible, but mentally flexible. That's the hardest thing to get over, is the disappointment if things don't work out the way that you plan. I'm like, all right, that's cool. What can I do? Focus on what you can do in that moment, what your workaround is, as opposed to being sad and disappointed about what you can't do.
Yeah, that's so that I think has happened to many people, but definitely you had that silver lining and that serendipitous, just something you
Yes.
were not planning, but ended up being a wonderful day. And
Yep.
now you probably even have stronger memories of that trip than you
Yes.
ever would have otherwise. Great. There are two more questions from our guest. One is your travel more costly, and can you fly in economy class?
I used to be able to fly economy class. I can't anymore. I have bad leg spasms from MS. So if I do fly, I will fly economy for shorter flights. For domestic flights, but I usually try to fly like on Delta Comfort Plus or Economy Plus and United, whatever has more leg room. And I always try to fly in the bulkhead seat, because then I have more leg room in case I do have spasms. It's easier for me to cross my legs and do that way. If I'm flying overseas, I will fly at a minimum premium economy. Again, because of that leg room, there's no way I can do an overseas flight in coach. It's just way too uncomfortable for me. I can't do it. So yeah, I do have to spend more for that. For accessible tours, accessible shore excursions, absolutely. The cost is prohibitive for many people. I fly by myself. I travel by myself, so it ends up being a private tour that usually those tours can be split up among people. So I spend a lot more money than somebody without a disability, sometimes just to take an accessible taxi. So that kind of sucks. That really kind of sucks. And a lot of people cannot afford to travel in that regard. So I'm very lucky that I have the financial means to do it. But yeah, in certain cases, it's a lot more expensive. But let's say for like a cruise, an accessible stateroom will cost exactly the same amount of money as a regular stateroom in the same category. By law, they cannot charge you more for an accessible stateroom or for an accessible hotel room, as far as the equivalent goes. So in that regard, that's good.
Yeah, that's always good to hear. And I never really had thought about cruises being accessible, because in my mind, I've never taken a cruise, but in my mind, I'm always thinking it's such a narrow hallway, or maybe too many things. But
Oh
I
no,
really like that you're saying it's not, and you highly
oh, it's
recommend
great.
them, and that you've had great
Yes,
experiences. So that's good
absolutely.
to hear. We had one other question. Can you post some links to useful websites, or how do you find them? I guess travel blogs, your own travel blog, or
Yeah,
other websites. If you want to
yeah.
share them with me, I can always attach them to the YouTube description, and
Oh, sure.
would have access to that. But if you want to just name some of them now.
Yeah, Google is your friend. Absolutely. Again, my own blog, spintheglobe.net. Also a good friend of mine, and he lives in Lafayette. So he's about maybe an hour and a half outside of Atlanta, and then I think northwest part of Georgia. Corey Lee, and his website, he's amazing. His website is curbfree.com. So you can look at that. And then do a Google search for the ACAA, Air Carrier Access Act. That's easy to find. So yeah, Google is your friend. And then if you need to Google the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there's a lot of good information there.
Okay, great. We're almost out of, or we are out of time. Wow, it went by really fast. So my final question, I know you're going to Canada on a road trip, but what
Yeah.
is the another place that's on your bucket list for your next adventure?
Oh, good God.
Ju-
That's a good question. Well, I'm actually kind of fulfilling that, but I've been to Paris before, but not as a wheelchair user. So for my 50th birthday in September, I'm going to Paris. But what I'm going to do on my actual birthday, I'm going to take the train from Paris to Luxembourg.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I'll be there on my actual birthday. So that will be kind of a smaller bucket list item. I never really thought I could get there. But from Paris, I think it's only a 2-hour train ride. So I'll be doing that in September.
Great. And hopefully, due to the Olympics being there, I heard it's supposed to be the most accessible Olympics in the history of Olympics.
Yeah, fingers
That's a
crossed.
big,
So
big promise, but yeah, at least it's on their radar to make it that way. So I think they have made some improvements. Always could be
yes.
more, I'm sure, but at least
Yeah.
they're going in the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sylvia. This has been so exciting. And I know that our guests and viewers are going to be motivated and inspired to take their own accessible adventures. And hopefully we can share more travel tips in the future.
Thank you. And if any of you are on social media, you can find me on Instagram. That's one of my biggest platforms for my photos and videos. My handle, you can look me up under Spin the Globe, or my handle is Sylvia_Longmire. And then on Facebook, my Facebook page for Spin the Globe is Spin the Globe on Wheels, or you can just do a search for Spin the Globe on Facebook. Please follow me on social media, send me a message, say hi. If you have any more questions, you can find me that way.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Safe travels.
Thanks.